Hi, I'm Jane Morell, founder and CEO of Carer Solutions.
And hello again, I'm David Boyles, Head of Brand Communications and Government Affairs, also at Carer Solutions. And welcome to episode 2 of Built Different, where today's topic is the sector that no one talks about. Now, Jane, this is, I suppose, a topic we've chatted about a fair bit over the years. And the irony that disability is everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Yes.
It's something that impacts millions of Australians, yet is barely noticed or talked about in kind of mainstream culture unless you've directly been affected or impacted by disability or something has gone wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's worth for us caveating up front that today's conversation is very subjective and intentionally so.
Yeah.
You know, we really feel this is an important conversation to have, and we want to hear different opinions and different perspectives on what we discuss today.
Yeah.
So, without further ado, shall we kick off?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jane, my first question for you is, why do you think that disability has almost become invisible within mainstream culture when it impacts so many Australians?
Yeah, it's a really it's a big question. It's a really important one. I think we should start by saying disability affects 5.5 million Australians, which is about 25% of our population. So it is it's not a minority group of people. There are a significant amount of people across the country living with disability. And I think if we look back in the way traditionally that we've treated people living with disability, it's always been quite different and quite segregated part of the community. We can only think back to, sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago, so in recent history, where we had people with disability that were living in our community, that we had institutionalised them. Yeah. So you think about places in Victoria, obviously where we're located, which is like Kew Cottages, places, there was an asylum out in Sunbury that effectively became a university campus later on in the piece. But these were places where we put people with disability, they had to live there, they were shunned away from society, and that's how we've just traditionally treated people. So if you look back to those times, and disability was, we tried to make it invisible as a society. And I guess you can argue in this day and age, that has affected a lot of the way in which we talk about or don't talk about disability in our space and just in the wider community at large.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, the point you just made there. I remember reading quite recently that in the 1940s and I think the 1970s, the British royal family were hiding members of the royal family who had disabilities away from, they were hidden.
Crazy.
The public didn't know about them.
Crazy, yeah.
That really wasn't that long ago.
No, not at all.
And it's really interesting, based on this, people have almost learned to look away.
Yeah.
And disability can happen at any time. It's not necessarily just something you're born with.
Completely, yeah.
I suppose quite a broad question, but why do you think people have kind of learned to look away from the possibility that one day they might be impacted by disability?
Yeah. Totally, and I think we all do. And I think, again, the large reason for that is culturally. We weren't, from a very young age until more recently, educated, in our school systems about what it's like to go to school with somebody that looks different or might have different abilities to what you do. Sort of think back to my time going through school, it was, a lot of children with disability were not in mainstream schools. They were in specialist schools and they called a blue bus to school. So they had their own transport. So, I think when you're seeing those things from a very young age, that's your first impression. And your first impression is your lasting impression. So that's how you've always grown up to think about it. It's been that, that deliberate segregation and that, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind way that society's always dealt with, so to speak, people living with disability. And, our privilege, where we live in a society where, we're very fortunate, we're very lucky. We take so much of our lives and our ability to get out of bed in the morning and brush our teeth and go to a job and drive home for granted. And so we think that happens to another section of the community and that's never going to happen to me. Yeah. Or we get people saying to us, which is crazy, even in this day and age. I don't know anyone that lives with a disability. And it's like, okay, do you understand that mental health is also classified as disability? Because we certainly know the numbers of Australians, that are affected by mental health. So you don't have to look out that far outside of your scope or your circle to understand that you are affected and you actually can be affected. In the future, that could be a real possibility for you, but we don't think that way because of our privilege.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is great to see, I suppose, a little bit more awareness around neurodiversity at the moment, but there's still a real long way to go.
Yeah.
And, I think it's fair to say that people do become quite interested in disability or the NDIS when something goes wrong, or there are these, sensationalist headlines splattered across news outlets.
Yeah.
What do you think that says about us as a nation, I suppose, on a cultural level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it says a lot about us and the state of the world and our society. We spend a lot of our lives, obviously, in this day and age. We live online. We're always, scrolling or doom scrolling through our phones, and, we're looking for that dopamine hit. So what's that next headline? And that next headline, particularly in our space, is always negative. It's about, providers that are, ripping off the sector, or the taxpayers and all the money from taxpayers that are put into this scheme, and what that's costing and how much it's blown out to. And that's all we're seeing, because in reality, that's what gets eyes. And that's what everybody, wants to read, which is really unfortunate. And for us, we find that very frustrating, because we're putting all providers are put in the same bucket in that sense. So we're all tainted with that same brush, when in reality, that's not, it's certainly not what exists in our own world. And it's certainly not the way in which we operate, but it just happens because that's what everyone is drawn to.
It is, and we're seeing people read these headlines, or maybe the first paragraph of an article, and suddenly thinking they're, subject matter experts. I was at swimming training a few weeks ago, and afterwards someone said, "Oh, so what have you got on today?" And I mentioned that we're actually going to go and meet a senator to discuss some of the NDIS reform coming on.
Yeah.
And his reaction was, "Oh, you work in the NDIS. I'm glad to see my tax is going towards sex workers."
Wow.
And that was his whole opinion of the NDIS. And I had to ask him why, why he made that observation.
Yeah.
And he mentioned it was because of an article he had read. So I had to slightly educate him quickly on that matter. But it was a whole perception around a scheme was based on that one article, and it was really disappointing. But I think the reality of, I suppose, the world we live in at the moment.
It definitely is. And, we speak about this quite a bit. I remember the time when I first started this business, where, people didn't know. I was explaining what I was doing. Everyone's always intrigued when you're starting something. And I said, it's in the NDIS space. And they didn't know what the NDIS was. So I'd start, explaining what that was. And then now I tend to shy away from that, to be honest, because, you sort of get these reactions from people. I read about that in the paper the other day. And it's always negative, especially these days. So it's very disappointing. Especially for, providers that are, incredibly well-intended and have been doing some incredible work for a very, very long time, like ourselves, for nearly 15 years. So,
It's why we have to have these conversations
Definitely.
as well. And I want to touch on, you mentioned earlier around the importance of disability being normalised at a really young age, when 5 or 6 year olds opening their book, for example. What do you think, if disability was to become part of everyday conversation, what do you think people would learn to, I suppose, appreciate more about disability, or potentially think differently?
Yeah. I think people would very much see and learn if they were educated on it from an early age, as you've said, to just understand how complex it is to navigate.
Absolutely.
And maybe understand a little bit more and not be so ignorant about our system and how challenging it is for families and providers to navigate a system that the government is, or a plane that the government is building and flying at the same time and has been for a very long time. I think there'd be an appreciation for that and an understanding that if you're contributing to that as a taxpayer, you're actually contributing to making an incredible difference in people's lives, which I think is something that's completely lost.
Absolutely.
And Joe Blow walking around the street doesn't understand that because, we're not actually talking about that in that way. So I think that's really important, and that's one thing that people would take away. They'd also understand that, being different doesn't mean, if I've got a different set of abilities to the next person, doesn't mean I can't do certain things. I think it would help just, knock down some of those walls and those negative perceptions that you have of
stereotypes.
Correct, and stereotypes of it being, the government's problem or a part of the community that I don't have contact with or I don't have anything to do with. I think it would break that down a lot.
And when you're just talking then, something sprung to mind. It's a little bit contentious, but
Yes.
I'm going to ask it. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to ask it anyway.
Cool.
We've discussed awareness days a bit, you and I, and you have quite, I suppose, a different opinion on those. Are you comfortable sharing that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I've always thought that awareness, and take the 3rd of December, for example, International Day for People Living with Disability, it feels very tokenistic. Why do we have one day where we're celebrating people with disability? Why can't we celebrate every single day? Just like we should with, women. If it's International Women's Day, celebrate every day. Also, if we're, if it's race or your sexuality, whatever it might be, like, why are we choosing these specific days to celebrate? I understand the whole notion behind that, but if we're living in a society where we feel like, it's our human right to include everybody, why are we singling out special days?
Yeah. And we're doing it because that discrimination and that, I suppose, that lack of inclusivity does exist in society. So essentially what you're saying is, how amazing would it be to get to a stage where we no longer needed these days because these were no longer issues and things that we talk about naturally in everyday conversation.
Totally.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, really interesting. And I kind of want to shift the conversation now. We've touched on some of the societal or cultural challenges on this topic, and I want to talk about government.
Yes.
And this is something we touched on a little bit in the first episode. I want to dig a little bit deeper.
Sure.
Do you feel that the way that governments are currently designing or have designed systems to date have played, I suppose, a role in keeping disability out of everyday conversation in mainstream Australia?
Yeah, I actually do. And I think that's happened a lot more recently than ever before because of certain, obviously, stands that the government's had to take around the scheme in relation to financial. So, pulling back on the amount of spending and the amount of funding that is being put out there. And that's being felt, obviously, by the participants and the families. And I think that's what happens when the financial outcomes become actually more important than the humanity. Yeah. If we roll it right back to, sort of 11 years ago now when the NDIS, 10, 11 years when the NDIS was started, it was all about pure choice, pure control for people. There was huge celebrations, understandably so, that we were moving into a time and a scheme that was going to revolutionise the way people receive supports and care and funding. It has done that, but, there was a lot of funding given out. There was still designing at the time, so not enough thought put into some of what was being created then. And then you get to a position now where you're pulling back on that, and that whole human element that you had at the beginning is almost now completely gone. And that's really confronting and really challenging for people that, we're receiving a certain amount of support and care and now can't because of the funding constraints that are now on their plans, which is really difficult for people.
I think I read recently in the Saturday paper that since the plan reassessments back in May, a third of participants have seen a significant cut, and that's resulted in, I think it was a 22 or 22.5% saving in terms of funding. So, yeah, I think that's proof in the pudding,
I think so,
essentially.
definitely.
And,
Yep.
you know, you and I have been in a fair few government meetings over the years. Do you feel that they're collaborative?
They're definitely collaborative when you're in them. You can be sitting there having an incredible conversation. You've got an audience that's very engaged. And then obviously post those meetings, when you send through your email with a follow-up and you potentially attach some documentation that refers to what you were speaking about in the meeting that they've requested, which is great. You radio silence.
Yeah.
So that's really challenging. It's really disheartening. It's really demotivating. And also we've had other experiences where we've had ministers potentially not rock up to a meeting, which is also really difficult, especially when you've flown to another state to have that conversation in person, and you've prepared for that meeting at length. And also we've had different instances where we've had ministers sort of race into the meeting, take a quick photo and then race out and not actually have the meeting with you because they're too busy.
Yeah.
And on the flip side of that, of all those experiences that aren't great, we've had some incredible outcomes with government ministers and their advisors. But yeah, it's also, like I said, just really difficult when you're on the receiving end of a meeting that actually doesn't even take place. And you've committed to be there, and paid to be there, and then it doesn't eventuate, which is really frustrating.
I think, the lack of follow-up is also really frustrating.
Huge.
As you said, we get, there's lots of providers out there.
Yeah, of course.
We get that behind the scenes in their world, there might be bureaucracy and red tape, but just update us.
Totally.
We're
One line and an
investing so
email.
much into being that squeaky wheel.
Yeah.
We come out of these meetings going, wow, they were really engaged. And then
Nothing.
tweet. No,
Yeah.
crickets. That's what it's meant to be.
Yeah.
But what I'd like to discuss next is advocates.
Yes.
And I think this follows on quite nicely from what we just discussed. Do you feel that, I suppose, that there's this behavioural trend at the moment that advocates have become quite careful? They're almost tiptoeing around these relationships instead of challenging. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. I think culturally in this space, I think inherently you've been sort of felt or positioned to feel like you should be happy with what you're given. Just get what you're given. If it's the scraps, just be happy with that. Don't ask for any more. So I think people have traditionally been coming from that angle. I think advocates included to a certain degree. And then, more recently, absolutely, we've seen a lot of people sort of being quite subservient, not really going the whole hog or full in on a question, semi-backing down because of fear. They're fearful that whatever they might say or they bring to the forefront, will affect the state of the sector even more. And that's a really sad thing to see. I think also as providers in our space, we're often subservient. We sit back and we just, won't rock the boat, won't ask the difficult question, we'll shy away while we watch, I guess the powers that be, so to speak, continue to sort of kick the can down the road, and not respond to us or have our submissions that fall into a bit of a black hole and then feel like, oh, we can't say anything. And your line around, I think it's important to share your line around the position that we feel like we're in when that happens.
Yeah, I suppose I mean this absolutely respectfully.
Totally.
But there's, I suppose, some irony that, we act very subservient in these meetings where we're actually talking with and meeting with public servants. So a little bit of irony, and I do mean that respectfully,
Absolutely.
but there is an undertone.
I think so, yeah. And I think it's important to talk about that, like you said, respectfully. But when that is your experience, it's really difficult because it goes back to sort of that line about, what is the definition of insanity?
Yeah.
And it's continuing to do the same thing over and over and get the same results.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important that we talk about that and, keen to understand a lot of others and their experience
Absolutely.
in that way as well.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about on a cultural level and a government level this issue of silence or not talking about disability and the challenges of the sector openly. What do you think, I suppose, the cost of this is to people living with disabilities themselves and their families?
Yeah, it's huge. There's incredible burnout from carers out there. There's burnout from families. There's the breakdown of the family, dynamic. Which has been proven as a result of people just being at their wits' end in navigating this complexity and not being able to be heard in certain conversations and things that change up in an instant, which in their world is everything, because that changes their ability to be able to employ support workers, or it changes their ability to be able to provide transport all of a sudden, or just these sudden changes that are huge life changes for people that are not taken into account a lot of the time when those decisions are being made, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The cost cutting is coming before the human side. That it's monumental, the effects on the families.
Absolutely. And I think also, we discussed this in the car coming here, the exodus of providers at the moment as, I suppose, a knock-on effect of what we're discussing.
Absolutely. I read a stat a couple of days ago that 16% of NDIS providers are actually thinking about whether they'll continue to operate within the NDIS because of the state of the sector. And that's huge. And the knock-on effect for individuals that require those services and supports is massive. If those providers aren't going to provide those supports, some of them are quite specialised, the reality is no one's stepping into that space.
Yeah.
So what happens is people go without care or people go without support, and the knock-on effect of that, socially for the economy is massive.
Absolutely. And if that happens as well, there's not going to be support workers. And we have been talking about the support worker shortage crisis for years now. And, it's been broadly recognised at a government level as well.
Yeah.
Why do you think we're still talking about that in 2026 when this has been a crisis for years?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I can recall, 2-3 years ago now, there was a stat that was out there that we were certainly spoken to about, which was we would need in excess of 100,000 support workers by June 2025 to fulfill the support worker shortage. We're now in 2026 and obviously that hasn't happened. And in that time, we'll hope we'd see, a plan from government about what that would look like, how we're going to fill these gaps, what's the solution. And then what we did was we got on the front foot as an organisation and we started speaking to government and also the NDIA, the agency, National Disability Insurance Agency, about our model, direct employ, and how specifically that would contribute to assisting the support worker shortage, particularly in thin markets where, a lot of people had FIFO, so fly in, fly out services and supports, which are very expensive, costly to the scheme. And we spoke to them about our solution in being able to employ support workers locally from within their own communities. Yeah. We would obviously fly to those meetings, have those conversations, invest heavily in having those conversations, and then have a very collaborative conversation and then hear nothing. So that's been unfortunately our experience, specifically with the support worker shortage. And then obviously there are different submissions that we've contributed to more recently. Risk proportionate registration, very important upcoming change in our sector that we very much support. Quality and safeguards, we also put a submission through to that. And also very recently, what is the definition of a provider, which is critical for a service like ours that sits outside of, I guess, traditional service delivery and traditional service provision, to have our voice heard, for that submission to be read so we can have a seat at the table, so we can contribute to co-design. And we're obviously yet to hear, that's more recent.
I want to touch on that a little bit a bit later on.
Yes.
Because that's really important to talk about.
Definitely.
And I think also just around the support worker shortage issue, there's the cultural issue comes back into play as well. If people are thinking that this is a scheme full of neglect and badly behaved criminal support workers because a headline has said so.
Yeah.
Why would you want to join the scheme or become a
Totally.
support worker?
Totally. Yeah.
Next question, and I'm really interested a little bit about what you just mentioned here is,
Yes.
and it's a really big question, but based on what we've discussed today, do you think there's one thing that could, I suppose, transform or solve this, invisibility or silence challenge that we're facing?
Yeah, totally. I think that there's probably two major things, but the one, I think big and topical one at the moment in relation to the submissions I just referenced is co-design. And what we mean by that is real co-design. So having conversations with all different types of providers in the sector, all different shapes, all different sizes, not just the big players, providing all sorts of different types of services across the country in all sorts of areas. Really critical to hear those voices, have those conversations, talk about experiences, and then be able to shape, policy, etc. from that point. Yeah,
Absolutely.
really important.
Yeah, and that's on I suppose, a government policy level, anything
Yeah.
on a cultural level?
Yeah.
I did say
totally.
one, didn't I? No, I'm asking for two.
You did say one, but I'll offer two. The second one is, and we've touched on this earlier, is just definitely education, right?
Yeah.
Like just from a very young age, just normalizing and socializing conversations with children about disability or what it looks like to be in a setting, whether it's classroom, whether it's in sport, with children of all abilities.
Yeah.
Not just, what we classify as normal. Let's normalize everything because that's normal.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think doing that from a really young age is absolutely important. When we're obviously, of course, seeing a lot more of that recently.
Yeah.
We've spoken about, different brands that have, and I think Barbie's a great example with, making Barbie of all abilities, a Barbie with autism. There's all sorts of things that are coming out now. And, massive congratulations to those brands that are doing that. But that's only been in the last, 5-10 years? And, a lot of us and a lot of the people that are certainly in the positions of power at the moment in government making those decisions, they didn't grow up with autistic Barbie. So they're the ones that are responsible for making and shaping those policies and making those decisions. And our ideologies and the way that we're wired, the way we make decisions, just what we think about life in general is shaped by our environment and our cultural backgrounds and how we've been brought up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so education's hugely important.
And I think my question to conclude, I'm not asking you easy questions today.
No, you're not.
But I think ultimately, based on what we've just discussed, is this topic essentially a cultural issue or a policy issue? You can only choose one. I think at the highest level, what is it?
And I would absolutely say it's cultural.
Yeah.
Our cultural, the way we live, our belief system, that's what helps us design these policies. So if we start making the changes again super early on at a cultural level, we'll definitely see that come through in changing policies and designing policies that are fit for our entire world, people of all abilities, extending to our human rights, all those areas of crossover that are really important instead of, the flip side of that at the moment where we're designing based on, I think fear a lot of the time comes into play. We've let the scheme blow out billions and billions of dollars now. So now we're trying to pull it all back. So we're putting risk compliance, which are obviously incredibly important, of course, and also financials, the financial side of things ahead of the human side. And the longer we continue to do that, the more worrying and concern that we have for the state of the sector at large, as we mentioned, with, massive exodus in providers. Over 15% of providers contemplating removing themselves from operating in the sector. It's pretty bleak.
It's huge.
Yeah,
absolutely. And as mentioned, we'd love to hear your opinions and perspectives on what we've just discussed. You can leave a comment, message us directly, or we'd even be more than happy to discuss this topic over a cup of tea or a coffee.
absolutely.
Jane, thank you so much. Really
Thanks, David.
appreciate that you always talk so openly and boldly about some of these harder topics. And stay tuned. We'll be back next month with a new episode and a special guest.
Very excited.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.